I recently asked for some questions for a Q&A on my Patreon, and patron Colin asked about some of my weirder spiritual influences. I have touched on this stuff a bit on some paywalled podcasts on my Patreon, but not on here. So I thought I'd cut this question out and turn the response into a YouTube video. So first let me read the question. So Colin Gallagher asks, "You often reference more bizarre or out there ideas, a dissolved or expanded sense of self, often seen in mystical traditions and determinism, etc., etc., as well as quotations often from biblical or mystical poetry. You often have a very romantic and theatrical sense of describing things that we all love, and the supernatural within the natural forms often features in your work. You've advocated taking up meditation as well. Is there a philosophy, religious, spiritual system, and/or metaphysical outlook, idea, writer, or just line of thought that has interested you, influencing you as of recent or over your life? And why so? Generally speaking, thanks aplenty. The weirder stuff of the mind is always great." All right, well, I love this question, Colin. This is some of my favorite stuff, so thank you for asking it. I normally resist talking about this stuff specifically and personally on this public channel, mostly because people can get upset when you talk about this stuff. But let's violate that little rule today as an experiment, because I think the world is changing and art is changing, and conversations like this are going to become more important for artists to have. So I'm going to just give you a bit of a survey. These will be the things that come to mind today, but this is in no way a comprehensive list. I have been interested in this stuff all my life, and my seeking on these topics is one of my life's most consistent and deepest joys. There's some obvious keystones. First off, I was raised in a Catholic household and in a Catholic context. I went to Catholic schools for a considerable portion of my education. That definitely kept my head on the transcendent, on questions of God and the nature of reality right from the beginning of my life. I think if you're raised religiously, we kind of take it for granted that we are being posed ontological and existential questions on a weekly basis right from the beginning of life. Well, maybe calling them questions is a little charitable, but you know what I mean. I should also say my family took this all very seriously. True believers all around. That definitely leaves a mark. I do think I'm so interested in and take spirituality and mysticism and philosophy and all this other stuff seriously because I was raised by people who took it very seriously. If they hadn't clearly cared, who knows if I would have. My mom, dad, grandma, whole family are from Colombia. You might know how much Colombians love them some Catholicism. It's a special thing. So yeah, very strong energy there. My sister was an especially big influence, less on the religious side. She was always a seeker in the broader sense and sort of set a model for me there. When I fell in love with the art of the Renaissance, the work of the old masters, this reinforced a strong connection between my love for drawing and the imagery and symbolism of Catholicism. The pomp and circumstance that are Catholicism's glory, and in the eyes of the other denominations, hubris, has definitely affected my taste in what I think are obvious ways. Over the top, very embroidered, highly sensual, utterly lacking in restraint, attuned to anatomical display. That all sounds almost pejorative, but our history seems to have liked it fine. In some sense, most of the work I do for myself could be roughly construed as religious art. Though I'm not a religious person, I'm a fan of the world's religions, but I wouldn't say I ascribe to any of them. Unless you count drawing as a religion, which you shouldn't, but I do. As to specific influences in those Catholic currents, I can't cite much for you. I didn't and don't read any Catholic stuff. I just listened in church as a kid. You know, you get a good earful of the Bible. You pick up a lot that way. I have heard many of the ideas of the geniuses of the theological tradition, like Thomas Aquinas, Meister Eckhart, Thomas Merton, and some of their work I've read directly, but mostly just summaries in other philosophy books, if I'm honest. One I like is DK's The Philosophy Book, Big Ideas Simply Explained, which I highly recommend. When I mention a book in this video, I will link it in the description. If you're interested in Catholicism in a mystical sense, stick to the heresies. That's the good stuff. Yeah. I recently read the Apocryphon of John for the first time, looking at some Gnostic source texts, and yeah, that's art fuel for sure. Speaking of Eckhart's, when I was probably around 13, I read a copy of The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle that my sister had sitting on a bookshelf. That, I think, was the very first time I encountered ideas like staying in the present, non-duality, not being your thoughts, and ideas involving the dissolution of the sense of self. I remember having my little mind blown and spending a few days walking around California, focusing intensely on what was occurring in the present, and marveling at the fact that there was actually nothing else to focus on. I don't remember that being framed as a form of meditation when I read that book, but looking back, I was walking around being mindful. It wasn't long, though, before my attention went back to the little teen love mangas that I was reading at the time. When I was around 14 or 15, I encountered Zen Buddhism for the first time in a little handbook called Zen and the Martial Arts by Joe Hyams. That began a lifelong interest in the concepts of Buddhism. That book led me to another with a similar title, Zen in the Art of Archery by Eugen Herrigel, still a favorite of mine. I remember crying at the end of the book when the teacher says, in farewell to his student, "Send me photographs from time to time so that I can see how you draw the bow. Then I shall know everything I need to know." I just teared up again, looking it up, to quote it. I have never read the most famous book that shares that titular structure. It's called Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, though I probably should. But because these two books were my first encounter with these concepts, I was not first inspired to engage with Zen by sitting and meditating. I was instead inspired to pursue spontaneous action and flow in the pursuit of mastery of an art form. As you can probably tell, those two books are very focused on that, just based on their titles even. Naturally, I applied my efforts there to drawing, not martial arts or archery. I first attempted to actually sit and meditate after reading The Mumonkan, The Gateless Gate, and The Blue Cliff Record at 18. This would have been while I was working on my entrance portfolio to Art Center College of Design. The Mumonkan and The Blue Cliff Record are collections of Zen koans, sort of narrative, quasi-historical mind puzzles traditionally used in Zen to train students to insert debate between Zen schools here. Either way, I was without a teacher and was not engaging Zen formally, so I just read the Mumonkan like a novel instead of as the sort of workbook that it is meant to be. And I loved it. I mean, I fell in love. It was the first mystical text, as opposed to a doctrinal text, I had ever read, but my initial enjoyment of it was because of the writing, because of the randomness, the total obliqueness of it, how impossible it was to understand its uncompromising nature. Having fallen in love, I sort of snapped into it and wondered, wait a second, what the hell is this actually about? After a little research, learning how seriously people took it, that people took the koan seriously, and more importantly, that people took kensho seriously, the glimpse of something that the koans are supposed to elicit, well, it all made me very curious. Catholicism doesn't really have an analog to this, at least not a popular one. Catholicism has a long list of things you're supposed to believe, and some of the absolute most beautiful debate and reasoning for why you should believe those things. But Zen had a thing it wanted you to experience. That was new to me. That was interesting. In Catholicism, if you experience anything very nice, very interesting, it's sort of a pleasant accident, a nice little surprise. Zen was focused on this, it seems. So I continued my trajectory of doing the meditative arc totally backwards. I had started by trying to apply spontaneous action to an art form, to actions in the world. And now I sat to meditate not to relieve suffering, but instead to leap directly to some goal state, to experience Kensho out of sheer curiosity. This is a little unusual, as far as I can tell. Most people start meditating to relieve suffering. If they're tuned into Buddhist religiosity, they might be doing it to end suffering forever. But my life was light on suffering up until this point. Zen in the art of archery made me want to draw beautifully from a particular mind state. And that's it. And the Gateless Gate made me want to understand what the hell these monks were experiencing that was changing their life so profoundly. I never doubted for a second that what they were going through was real. Mind you, if you've only read the koans and never read the words of the Buddha, as I hadn't at this point, it's not super clear that soothing painful emotion is part of this. I mean, the stories are chaotic. There's a lot of people getting hurt and cutting off fingers in these koans. Anyway, I would say my experience trying to meditate was textbook. Sitting to meditate was a crushing encounter with the total intractability of my mind. I experienced the painful truth that the quality of the mind was unwieldy, relentless, like a caged animal, and that if there was free will, it extended much more to choosing what cereal to eat for breakfast than it did to whether you could willfully focus on something for even a minute. Shortly after this, I entered college, and much of my spiritual interest was forcibly restricted by the rigors of my program. But my love was too deep, so I still did find some time to do things. I read several books by the Dalai Lama during this time. The one I remember most clearly is The Universe in a Single Atom. And I memorialized my love for the koans by naming several characters in school projects after legendary, wily Zen masters like Joshu. I also managed to make it to an actual Zen center, the Hazy Moon in Los Angeles, just once. I sat for the Dharma talk, that's basically a sermon, and spoke with some of the attendees afterwards, but I don't remember sitting and meditating there. Maybe I was late and I missed it? I'm not sure. I remember I introduced myself to someone who was washing dishes in the kitchen downstairs and was shocked to find out that it was Karen Mazin Miller, who had written a Zen book I'd recently read called Hand Wash Cold. What a coincidence. Anyway, I found myself too busy to go back. School was just a lot, and it was quite a drive from my place. So yeah, I was only there the one time. But I went to the Hazy Moon in the first place because I was very familiar with the teachers. I had found that they uploaded their Dharma talks online for free, and I had listened to many, many hours of them while working long, cold, dark nights in my bedroom on school assignments. Behind my drafting table, my very official and expensive Zafu and Zabuton, cushions for sitting meditation, sat mostly unused. I did sit and meditate sometimes. The talks I was listening to and the books I was reading always made me want to, but the experience was still remarkably difficult. And it often amounted to a game of let's guess how long has gone by since the last time I peeked at the clock. My mind in this period was obsessed with clock time. How much time do I have to draw this assignment? Time to sleep? Time to get to school? It was much more comfortable for me to load up some soothing talk by Hiroshi and get some work done while listening, and just dreaming of a time that I might get to sit and investigate the nature of my mind in peace. Outside of sitting, though, I did use many of the techniques I learned in the books and from the talks during the day. When stress would overcome me on a drive, in the hallways at school, I'd always try to notice my breath, ground myself where I was, and recognize that all there really was this, right now. The act of drawing, I also still tried to do in a sort of Zen fashion, spontaneous action in the pursuit of mastery. I always sought ease and flow. I avoided torturing drawings. The irony being that in trying to do that, you often wind up torturing them. I did weirder things too, like drawing with my eyes closed, trying to connect dots with straight lines without looking at the goal dot. Don't ask me to explain to you today why I thought these things were somehow aligned with Zen. They were more aligned with what might have looked cool if someone were filming me or something like that, which is ironic because I didn't record myself back then, but now I record myself a lot and I never do any of that. Ever since I had read Zen and the Art of Archery, I considered drawing a meditation, and I tried to do it in such a way as often as I could be mindful of it, even during the highly structured, vigorously disciplined portion of my training, both before and after college. In some sense, those were my formative years as an acolyte, locked in monkish devotion. I have spent many thousands of hours in that state. When I left school for my full-time studio job, I found my life was much simpler and I had more time, especially during work, where no one cared if I had YouTube going all day while I worked on the pictures. This was about 2013. So I invested many of those media hours into my more out there interest, supercharged by the repression that had occurred in college. I think I listened to all of Alan Watts at this point. If you've never heard of Alan, he's one of the most famous popularizers of Buddhism in the West. He was working mostly in the 60s and 70s, and he's also one of the grand masters of public speaking. Back when he was alive, he was probably more famous for his books, and now he's probably more famous for his recorded talks. And these talks were appearing and disappearing with regularity on YouTube at this point in 2013. Enough good things have been said about Alan, but I would definitely recommend him. I really think he had it all figured out. Some people actually wind up figuring it out. Crazy. Alan Watts is probably my single biggest influence on a great variety of things. Probably most significantly for me, I think Alan Watts was the first person to instill the doubt in free will in me. And that was later to be fully eradicated by the clinical dissections of Sam Harris, who I would also recommend, with some trigger warnings for various political and religious tripwires. I tried to warn you. It was not until after I had kicked my belief in free will because of Alan and Sam that I realized Buddhism and Zen had been very concerned with the lack of free will as well, the whole time. But ain't that how it goes? You know, you only hear what you're ready for. Anyway, that was a good couple years of voraciously gobbling up all the esoterica, mysticism, theological debate, and Christian apologetics that were emergent in that era of YouTube. Ugh, I look back fondly on those times. Just 8 hours a day of making art while learning as much as I could through videos and audiobooks, and work-life balance. I would just leave work at 5 and do whatever. And then in 2015, my father died by suicide, and what had been curious, happy consumption of the ontological and existential became horribly practical and urgent. The 4 years between 2015 and 2019 were hard. I spent a lot of time in support groups. I explored psychology more, and time I might otherwise have spent reading St. John of the Cross, I spent reading books on the clinical, statistical, and ethical history of suicide and self-harm in general. In hindsight, it was a bit of an obsession. I was hurt and processing, but much of it was genuinely very interesting. I still think a lot about what I learned in that time. Some of the books I read remain favorites. Night Falls Fast by K. Redfield Jameson, I would recommend for anyone trying to understand these things. And the University of Utah's Ethics of Suicide Digital Archive is one of the most amazing collections of anything that I've ever encountered. The art that I made in that time was completely transformative for me. Most of you are here because of drawings not done in that time, but using techniques, theories, and formalisms that I developed in that time. But along with the experience itself, all of that thinking about it left my nerves deeply rattled. Like I said, I was hurt. And so we returned to my backwards arc with meditation. For the first time in my life, I left behind the application of spontaneous action. I left behind my interest in the goal, Kensho, insight. And I just sat down to meditate to relieve my racked nerves, my addled mind. You know, the reason most people start. I just wanted a momentary reprieve from feelings of grief, of mourning, of confusion, of loneliness, of betrayal, of anger. I was so very tired. So tired. Sam Harris's meditation app, Waking Up, was very useful here. It was the first time I'd ever used guided meditations. As far as I could tell, the monks in my stories meditated in silence, so I'd never used them before. Also useful was the 10% Happier app, which has many guided meditations by Joseph Goldstein, who was a very good meditation teacher. The world has a deep sense of irony. Now that I was just trying to experience some simple moments of peace in the midst of dark, dark days spent drawing cat people for the Elder Scrolls, the whole thing just unraveled. That was March of 2019. It's been about 5 years now. 'Tis the season, I suppose. I won't talk about the particulars of that experience. You traditionally don't, which I think makes sense. And I'm not going to claim to know what happened or what the hell it was. You shouldn't kiss and tell. And a heated tryst with the ground floor of reality is not something to be gossiped about lightly. Anyway, I'm not quite sure I'd recommend it to everybody, but I would recommend it to most. Suffice to say, a few days later, I decided to make this YouTube channel, and I've felt much better ever since. You can track my continued thinking on philosophy, mysticism, and how they overlap with art by watching the first videos I made on this channel back in mid-2019, just a couple months after my experience. In the past 5 years, I've focused on engaging these concepts more with others and developing community instead of being locked in my own head. To dog-ear some thinkers and philosophies that have my interest these days, I've come to find Plato very, very interesting. Been doing a lot of thinking about the Platonic forms lately. Pythagoras was basically a cult leader. Did you know that? He thought contemplation could free one from the cycle of birth and death. Sounds like Buddhism, doesn't it? Very weird. Oh yeah, I spent more time recently reading the Buddha's words directly, rather than the teachings of the emergent schools, sects, and guided meditations. I can recommend In the Buddha's Words by Bhikkhu Bodhi as a general survey of that. I haven't gone much deeper than that myself. The only thing that I've looked at in greater detail is the Satipatthana Sutta, the original discourse where the Buddha explains meditation. And I did that through Joseph Goldstein's tome of a commentary on it. It's called Mindfulness, A Practical Guide to Awakening. I'm really not sure I can recommend it unless you already have some ardency for meditation. If you're just curious about it, I don't think this is going to get you into it. It's very repetitive and technical. You've already got to be into meditation, I think. Whenever I need an inner pilgrimage, I'll listen to a reading of the Diamond Sutra, which really seems to capture so much of the nature of Zen and the koans. You know, I saw an old, beautiful copy of the Diamond Sutra in the Tokyo Metropolitan Art Museum when I was there. It's the first creative work with an explicit public domain attribution. How cool is that? It says at the end, for universal free distribution. Indeed, my friends. In recent years, a sort of non-dual niche has emerged on YouTube, and that's very interesting. If these had been around or I had known about them at the time of some of my experiences, I surely would have availed myself of them rather than muddling through on my own with no community, no teacher, just my memories of implications between sentences in old books. I haven't investigated these closely enough to make a real hard recommendation, but they're worth mentioning, and you'll probably encounter a channel that is someone's name with non-duality after it at some point, if you're into this stuff. I have watched some of Suzanne Chang's videos on her channel, Suzanne Non-Duality, and yeah, I think I would have had these on loop at that time had they been around then. On that note, I'll just rattle off a few philosophy, spirituality, and mysticism YouTube channels that I really like. Again, I will link these in the description, but just to say them, Cosmic Skeptic, Rationality Rules, ContraPoints, Philosophy Tube, Esoterica, Exurbia, Samaneri Jayasara's YouTube channel, Wisdom of the Masters, Robinson Earhart's podcast, Guru Viking's podcast, Hochalaga, and you can hear tons of Alan Watts talks on YouTube just by searching his name, and most of his catalog is collected neatly on the Waking Up Meditation app as well. A final note, left out of this survey is my interest in science, which I would say has equally colored my philosophy, art, and worldview. A different discussion though, I think. To sum it up, when I was young, I spent much time sitting and visualizing, basically meditating on black holes, the size of stars, and just kind of letting that calm me and put me into altered states of consciousness. I was not aware that I was doing that or that that's what it was doing to me when I was doing it. I was just doing it. Before I decided to pursue art as a career at age 14, after seeing Star Wars Episode 3, my career goal was to be a cosmologist. There was nothing so interesting to me as theories about the history of the universe and its possible futures. I thought a cosmologist's job was just what I saw them do on TV documentaries. That is to say, just talk excitedly about black holes in front of cameras. And yeah, I could definitely do that. That sounded pretty good. That's a job. I'm in. When an actual scientist explained to me what the job looked like in an advanced placement class when I was in high school, I figured it would be much easier to become a professional artist instead. Yeah. In the dark years after my father's death, I would often listen to the last chapter of Brian Greene's Until the End of Time to put me to sleep. That last chapter is a sweeping portrait of the entire history of the cosmos, from its birth to its eternal death. I have always found such large thoughts calming, not anxiety-inducing, like some do. That's also a book I would recommend. With that, I leave you, friends. Happy drawing, and journey well.